The transport vessel Meridian's Edge shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its hull groaning under the stress of dimensional compression. Lieutenant Marcus Chen pressed his face against the viewport, watching as the alien world of Kelthera materialized before them, a planet of impossible proportions where even the grass seemed to reach toward the heavens with deliberate intent. The briefing had mentioned the unusual gravitational properties, the oversized flora, and the indigenous population's remarkable stature, but seeing it firsthand sent a chill down his spine. "First time on a macro world, Lieutenant?" Captain Rodriguez asked, her weathered hands steady on the navigation console despite the ship's violent trembling. Marcus nodded, unable to tear his gaze away from the towering crystal formations that jutted from the planet's surface like frozen lightning. The xenobiology reports didn't quite capture the scale of everything. "They never do," Rodriguez replied, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent navigating the outer rim territories. The Keltherans average 12 feet in height, with some reaching 15. Their society operates on principles we're still trying to understand, honor-bound to a degree that makes old Earth samurai look casual about their commitments. The ship's AI announced their descent toward the designated landing zone, a flat expanse of what appeared to be cultivated crystal gardens. As they approached, Marcus could make out figures moving among the towering structures, the Keltherans themselves, their elongated forms moving with a grace that seemed to defy their impressive bulk. The Meridian's Edge touched down with a gentle thrum, its landing struts adjusting automatically to the planet's unique gravitational field. Marcus felt the familiar flutter of pre-mission anxiety in his stomach, the same sensation he'd experienced before every diplomatic encounter since joining the Terran Diplomatic Corps. At 28, he was young for his position, but his talent for languages and cultural adaptation had earned him a place on this critical mission. The objective was straightforward: establish preliminary trade relations with the Keltherans, whose crystal-based technology had proven invaluable in hyperspace navigation. The mission was classified as low-risk, a routine first-contact protocol with a species that had already demonstrated peaceful intentions through long-range communications. What the briefings hadn't mentioned was the intensity of Keltheran culture, the weight their society placed on every spoken word, and the consequences of misunderstanding their social contracts. Marcus checked his translation device one final time, ensuring the neural interface was properly calibrated for the Keltheran linguistic patterns. The device would handle basic translation, but the nuances of their speech, the tonal implications, the cultural context, the binding nature of certain phrases required careful attention from the speaker. Captain Rodriguez placed a hand on his shoulder as he prepared to disembark. "Remember, Chen, they take words seriously here. Don't make any promises you can't keep, and be careful about hypotheticals. On Kelthera, intention matters less than interpretation." The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss, and Marcus stepped onto the crystalline surface of an alien world. The gravity felt strange beneath his feet, slightly heavier than Earth standard but with an odd quality that made each step feel more deliberate, more final. The air carried scents he couldn't identify: ozone and something floral, but deeper and more complex than any Earth flower. A delegation awaited him at the edge of the landing zone, their forms silhouetted against the setting sun of Kelthera's primary star. As they approached, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The briefings had described their height, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. The lead figure stood nearly 14 feet tall, her presence commanding even from a distance. She wore robes that seemed to be woven from crystallized light, their surface shifting and refracting the ambient illumination in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Her features were humanoid but refined, as if someone had taken the human form and stretched it toward an impossible ideal of elegance and strength. Her skin held a subtle luminescence, and her eyes were the color of deep space, not black, but a blue so dark it seemed to contain entire galaxies. As the delegation drew closer, Marcus activated his translation device and stepped forward, following the diplomatic protocols he'd memorized during the long journey to Kelthera. He raised his right hand in the traditional Keltheran greeting, palm open, fingers spread to show he carried no weapons. "Greetings," he said, the translation device rendering his words in the melodic tones of the Keltheran language. "I am Marcus Chen, representative of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. I come in peace, seeking understanding between our peoples." The tall figure, whom Marcus assumed was the leader of the delegation, studied him with those impossible eyes for a long moment before responding. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones. "Welcome, Marcus Chen of Terra," the translation device rendered her words. "I am Valethria, High Arbiter of the Western Crystaldoms, speaker for the Convergence of Minds. Your arrival has been long anticipated." Marcus felt a surge of relief at the formal but positive greeting. The preliminary communications had gone well, and it appeared the Kelthorans were indeed interested in establishing diplomatic relations. He smiled, a gesture that seemed to translate well across species barriers, as Valethria's expression softened slightly. "Thank you for receiving me, High Arbiter Valethria. I hope our discussions will prove beneficial to both our civilizations." "As do I," Valethria replied, gesturing toward the crystal structures in the distance. "Come. We have prepared quarters for you in the resonance spires. Tomorrow, we will begin the formal negotiations." As they walked through the crystal gardens, Marcus marveled at the intricate beauty of Kelthoran architecture. The buildings seemed to grow from the ground itself, their surfaces reflecting and amplifying natural light in ways that created ever-shifting patterns of brilliance. It was like walking through a living jewel, each facet revealing new depths of complexity. Valethria walked beside him, her massive stride adjusted to accommodate his smaller pace. Despite her overwhelming physical presence, she moved with a fluid grace that suggested incredible control over her body. Marcus found himself stealing glances at her, fascinated by the way the light seemed to dance across her crystalline robes. "Your world is incredible," he said, gesturing toward a particularly stunning formation that resembled a frozen waterfall of pure light. "The integration of natural crystal formations with your architecture is unlike anything in Terran space." "The crystals are not separate from us," Valethria explained, her tone taking on an educational quality. "They are partners in our civilization, as essential as water or air. We do not build upon the land, we harmonize with it, becoming part of its song." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he understood the metaphor. The translation device handled literal meanings well, but the cultural context of Kelthoran society was proving more complex than he'd anticipated. They reached the base of a towering spire that stretched impossibly high into the darkening sky. The structure's surface was covered in intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, creating a mesmerizing display of light and shadow. "These are the guest quarters?" Marcus asked, craning his neck to see the spire's peak. "Yes," Valethria replied, pressing her hand against a smooth section of the crystal wall. The material responded to her touch, sections sliding apart to reveal an opening that adjusted itself to accommodate Marcus's smaller stature. "The spire will provide for your needs and ensure your comfort during your stay." Marcus stepped through the opening and found himself in a circular chamber that defied his understanding of architecture. The walls curved upward and inward, creating a space that felt both intimate and vast. Soft light emanated from the crystal itself, providing illumination without obvious sources. Furniture grew from the floor: a bed, chairs, a work surface, all crafted from the same living crystal as the building itself. "This is remarkable," Marcus breathed, running his hand along the surface of what appeared to be a desk. The crystal was warm to the touch and seemed to respond to his presence, adjusting its shape and configuration slightly. "The spires are alive, in their way," Valethria explained from the doorway. "They will learn your preferences and adapt accordingly. Rest well, Marcus Chen of Terra. Tomorrow brings the weight of two civilizations' futures." As she turned to leave, Marcus felt a sudden impulse to say something, anything, to extend the conversation. There was something about Valethria that intrigued him beyond her role as a diplomatic contact. Perhaps it was her obvious intelligence, or the way she carried herself with such quiet authority, or simply the alien grace of her movements. "High Arbiter," he called out, causing her to pause and turn back toward him. "I want you to know that I'm committed to making this work. Whatever it takes to build a lasting friendship between our peoples, I'll do it. You have my word." The moment the words left his mouth, Marcus knew something had changed. Valethria's eyes widened, their deep blue depths seeming to flicker with internal light. The crystal chamber around them resonated with a low, harmonic tone that he felt more than heard. The very air seemed to thicken with significance. Valethria stepped back into the chamber, her expression transformed from polite diplomacy to something far more intense and complex. When she spoke, her voice carried new harmonics, deeper tones that the translation device struggled to render properly. Marcus Chen of Terra, she said, her words seeming to echo despite the chamber's acoustic properties, do you understand what you have just spoken? Marcus felt a chill of unease. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand. I was simply expressing my commitment to the success of our negotiations. Valethria moved closer, her imposing height suddenly feeling less comforting and more overwhelming. You said, whatever it takes, Marcus Chen. You gave your word. In our culture, such statements are not casual expressions, they are binding oaths, contracts written in the very fabric of intention and honor. The translation device began chiming softly, indicating it was having difficulty processing the cultural context of Valethria's words. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. High Arbiter, I meant no intention is irrelevant, Valethria interrupted, her voice taking on a formal, ritualistic quality. You have spoken an oath before a High Arbiter in a sacred space. Your words have been witnessed by the crystals themselves, recorded in the harmonic matrix of the spire. What has been spoken cannot be unspoken. Marcus's mind raced, trying to process the implications of what was happening. He had intended a simple expression of diplomatic goodwill, but somehow his words had been interpreted as something far more significant. The weight of cross-cultural misunderstanding settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. What does this mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Valethria's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained formal and ceremonial. It means, Marcus Chen of Terra, that you are now bound by sacred oath to ensure the success of our negotiations, whatever the cost. Your word has become part of the greater harmony, and, to break it would bring dissonance not just to you, but to both our peoples. The chamber seemed to pulse around them, the crystal walls shifting through subtle spectrums of color as if responding to the emotional weight of the conversation. Marcus felt trapped, not by physical barriers but by the crushing weight of cultural obligation he had unknowingly accepted. How do I fulfill such an oath? He asked, his diplomatic training struggling to find purchase in this unprecedented situation. That, Valethria replied, remains to be determined. But, know this, the oath you have sworn binds you not just to success, but to transformation. To fulfill a sacred promise requires becoming more than what you were. The weak version of yourself that spoke carelessly must be replaced by one capable of honoring the weight of words. As Valethria left him alone in the crystal chamber, Marcus sank onto the bed that had grown from the living floor. The reality of his situation began to settle in. He had accidentally bound himself to an alien concept of honor that he barely understood, in service of a mission whose success now carried consequences far beyond diplomatic relations. Outside his window, the Kelthoran night was falling, and the crystal formations began to glow with their own internal light, creating a landscape of impossible beauty. But, for Marcus, the beauty was overshadowed by the weight of his oath and the growing realization that he would need to become someone entirely different to honor the commitment he had unwittingly made. The next morning brought with it the harsh light of consequence. Marcus woke to find that the crystal chamber had indeed adapted to his presence, the bed had molded itself to his sleeping position, the room's temperature had adjusted to his preferences, and a section of the wall had reconfigured itself into something resembling a refreshment station. Despite the alien luxury, he felt the weight of his oath pressing down on him like a physical force. He activated his communication device to contact Captain Rodriguez, but found that the crystal structure interfered with the signal. Apparently, the Kelthorans maintained strict control over outside communications during formal negotiations, another detail that had been glossed over in the mission briefings. A soft chiming sound drew his attention to the chamber's entrance, where Valethria waited with two other Kelthorans. In the morning light, her presence seemed even more imposing, her crystalline robes catching and fragmenting the illumination into patterns that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere decoration. Good morning, Marcus Chen of Terra, she said, her voice maintaining the formal tone that had emerged the previous evening. I trust the spire provided adequate rest? Yes, thank you, Marcus replied, though rest had been elusive with the weight of his situation pressing on his mind. High Arbiter, about last night, we will address the implications of your oath in due time, Valethria interrupted gently but firmly. First, you must meet the full negotiation circle. Your binding promise affects not just our bilateral discussions, but the harmony of our entire civilization. Marcus followed Valethria and her companions through corridors that seemed to reshape themselves as they walked, the crystal walls flowing like liquid light around them. The deeper they went into the spire complex, the more he became aware of a subtle vibration in the air, not quite sound, not quite sensation, but something that seemed to resonate with the very structure of reality. They emerged into a vast circular chamber at the heart of the complex, its ceiling stretching so high it disappeared into misty blue light. Around the chamber's perimeter sat 12 other Kelthorans, each one distinctive in their dress and bearing, but all sharing the same overwhelming presence that seemed characteristic of their species. At the center of the circle stood a crystalline structure that pulsed with soft, rhythmic light, what Valethria had earlier referred to as the harmonic matrix. As Marcus approached, he could feel the structure responding to his presence, its pulsations shifting to match something, his heartbeat, perhaps, or some other biological rhythm. "Honored Circle," Valethria announced, her voice carrying easily through the vast space, "I present Marcus Chen of Terra, who has sworn sacred oath to ensure the success of our negotiations, whatever the cost." The words echoed through the chamber, and Marcus felt the weight of 13 alien gazes upon him. Each member of the circle studied him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern to something that might have been anticipation. An elderly Kelthoran with robes of deep purple crystal spoke first, his voice carrying harmonics that the translation device rendered with obvious difficulty. The human has bound himself without understanding the weight of his words. How can such an oath be considered valid? "Ignorance does not negate intention," Elder Crystallis, replied another circle member, this one draped in robes that seemed to shift between different states of matter. He spoke freely, in a sacred space, before a high arbiter. The Matrix has recorded his words and accepted them into the greater harmony. Marcus stepped forward, his diplomatic training finally asserting itself despite the surreal circumstances. "Honored Circle, I acknowledge that I spoke without full understanding of your cultural practices. However, I stand by my commitment to the success of our negotiations. I ask only for guidance in how to properly fulfill the obligations I have undertaken." The chamber fell silent except for the soft pulsing of the harmonic matrix. The circle members exchanged glances that seemed to carry entire conversations in their subtle expressions. Finally, Valethria spoke. "Your willingness to honor the oath despite its accidental nature speaks well of your character, Marcus Chen. However, the fulfillment of such a binding requires more than good intentions. It requires transformation, the destruction of the weak self that speaks carelessly, and the forging of a strong self capable of bearing the weight of absolute commitment." Elder Crystallis leaned forward in his crystalline chair. "Tell us, young human, what do you believe constitutes the success of these negotiations?" Marcus had prepared for this question during his journey to Kelthora, but now, under the weight of his oath and the intense scrutiny of the circle, his rehearsed answers seemed inadequate. "Initially, I believe success would mean establishing basic trade agreements for your crystal technology in exchange for Terran resources and knowledge. But I'm beginning to understand that your concept of success may be more complex." "Indeed," Valethria said, her expression showing approval at his insight. "For the Kelthorans, success in negotiation means achieving harmony not merely between the immediate parties, but between the larger forces they represent. True success creates resonance that strengthens the fabric of existence itself." Another circle member, whose robes seemed to contain miniature galaxies, spoke up. "Your people see trade as an exchange of resources. We see it as an opportunity to create symphonies of civilization, harmonies that span star systems and endure across eons." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the scope of what was being described. How could he possibly ensure success when the very definition of success exceeded anything he had been trained to achieve? "How do I learn to understand your concept of success well enough to guarantee it?" he asked. The chamber fell silent again, and Marcus could feel the harmonic matrix responding to his question, its pulsations becoming more complex and layered. Finally, Valethria rose from her seat, her imposing height emphasized by the chamber's vast scale. "You must undergo the trials of resonance," she announced. "3 challenges that will strip away the limitations of your current self and forge you into someone capable of achieving true harmony. Only by destroying your weak self can you become strong enough to honor the oath you have sworn." Elder Crystallis nodded slowly. "The trials are not without risk, young human. They will test not just your resolve, but the very foundations of your identity. Many Kelthorans never attempt them, content to live within the limitations of their unforged selves. And if I refuse? Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. Then, your oath becomes void, and, with it, any hope of successful negotiations, Belethria replied. Worse, the disharmony created by a broken sacred promise would resonate through both our civilizations, potentially destabilizing the very foundations of trust between our peoples. Marcus looked around the circle of alien faces, each one watching him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to his very soul. The weight of not just his own future, but the future of human Kelthoran relations, rested on his decision. What do these trials involve? He asked. Belethria smiled for the first time since he had met her, an expression that transformed her austere features into something almost warm. The first trial is the trial of truth, where you must confront the lies you tell yourself about your own nature. The second is the trial of strength, where you must face the limitations that hold you back from achieving your potential. The third is the trial of unity, where you must learn to harmonize not just with others, but with the fundamental forces of existence itself. And if I succeed? Then, you will have become someone capable of ensuring the success of our negotiations, whatever the cost. You will have forged yourself into a being of sufficient strength that no external force can destroy what you have become. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Everything about this situation was beyond his training, beyond his experience, beyond his comfort zone. But, perhaps that was the point. Perhaps becoming someone capable of honoring his oath required stepping so far beyond his current limitations that transformation was inevitable. I accept the trials, he said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. The harmonic matrix flared with brilliant light, and the chamber resonated with tones that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. Marcus felt something change within him at that moment, not a physical transformation, but a shift in the fundamental nature of his existence. The weak part of himself that had spoken carelessly was already beginning to die, making room for whatever he was meant to become. Belethria approached him, her massive form somehow managing to convey both authority and compassion. The trials begin at dawn tomorrow. Tonight, you must prepare yourself for the destruction of everything you believe yourself to be. As the circle dispersed in, Marcus was led back to his crystal chamber. He realized that his mission had evolved beyond anything he could have imagined. He was no longer simply a diplomat seeking trade agreements, he was a man about to undergo a fundamental transformation of his very being, forged in the crucible of alien wisdom and bound by the weight of his own carelessly spoken words. The crystal chamber felt different now, no longer a luxurious guest quarters but a chrysalis where his old self would complete its dying and something new would emerge. Outside his window, the crystal formations of Kelthora pulsed with their eternal light, and Marcus began to understand that he was about to become part of that same eternal harmony, for better or worse. The first trial came with the dawn, though dawn on Kelthora was unlike anything Marcus had experienced. Instead of a gradual lightening of the sky, the crystal formations across the landscape suddenly blazed to life, creating a symphony of light that seemed to sing in harmonies just beyond human hearing. The very air shimmered with resonant energy, and Marcus felt his bones vibrate in response to frequencies that had no earthly equivalent. Belethria arrived at his chamber as the crystalline dawn reached its peak intensity, her presence somehow even more commanding in the alien morning light. She wore different robes now, these seemed to be made of crystallized void, their surface absorbing light rather than reflecting it, creating the unsettling impression that she was wrapped in tangible darkness. The trial of truth awaits, she announced, her voice carrying new harmonics that made Marcus's translation device struggle with the rendering. Are you prepared to see yourself as you truly are? Marcus had spent the night in meditation, trying to prepare mentally for whatever the trials might bring. He had reviewed everything he knew about himself, his strengths, his weaknesses, his motivations, his fears. But, standing before Belethria in the crystal dawn, he realized that intellectual preparation would prove inadequate for what lay ahead. I'm as ready as I can be, he replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Belethria studied him with those impossible eyes, and Marcus had the unsettling sensation that she could see directly through his diplomatic training to the uncertain young man beneath. No, she said simply. You are not ready. But readiness is not required for truth, only willingness to accept what is revealed. She led him from the chamber through passages he hadn't seen before, crystal corridors that seemed to twist through dimensions that violated his understanding of geometry. As they walked, Marcus began to feel a strange sensation, as if layers of himself were being peeled away with each step. His diplomatic confidence, his professional competence, his carefully constructed persona, all of it began to feel thin and artificial. They emerged onto a platform that jutted out from the side of the spire, suspended impossibly high above the crystal landscape below. At the center of the platform stood a mirror unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. Its surface seemed to be made of crystallized time, reflecting not just his physical appearance but somehow showing the temporal layers of his existence. "Look," Belethria commanded, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Marcus approached the mirror hesitantly, and, at first saw only his reflection, a young man in diplomatic attire, slightly disheveled from a night of poor sleep, anxiety clear in his eyes. But, as he continued to look, the mirror began to show him more. He saw himself as a child, bright and eager but already learning to hide his insecurities behind performance. He saw his teenage years, marked by a desperate need for approval that drove him to excel academically while never truly understanding himself. He saw his early career, built on a foundation of imposter syndrome and the constant fear that someone would discover he wasn't as competent as he pretended to be. The mirror showed him the truth of his diplomatic mission, that he had volunteered not out of dedication to human-alien relations, but because success would advance his career and failure could be blamed on the inherent difficulties of first contact. It showed him the careful ways he crafted his persona to match what others expected, never allowing his authentic self to be seen or tested. Most painfully, it showed him the moment he had spoken his oath to Belethria not as an expression of noble commitment, but as an impulsive attempt to impress someone whose approval he craved, spoken without thought for the consequences because he had never learned to take full responsibility for his words. "What do you see?" Belethria asked, her voice somehow gentle despite its overwhelming power. Marcus found himself unable to speak for several long moments, the weight of honest self-perception crushing the carefully maintained image he had carried of himself. When he finally found his voice, it came out as barely a whisper. "I see someone who has been pretending his entire life. Someone who speaks without thinking because he's never had to face real consequences for his words. Someone who volunteered for this mission for selfish reasons and bound himself with a sacred oath as a form of showing off." The mirror continued to show him more every time he had chosen appearance over substance, every moment he had avoided difficult truths about himself, every way he had remained weak by refusing to acknowledge his weaknesses. "And what do you choose to do with this truth?" Belethria asked. Marcus looked at her reflection in the impossible mirror, seeing her not as the intimidating alien authority figure he had been trying to impress, but as someone offering him something he had never had before, the opportunity to become genuine. "I choose to stop pretending," he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I choose to acknowledge that the person I have been is not strong enough to honor the oath I swore. I choose to let that person die so someone better can take his place." The moment he spoke these words, Marcus felt something fundamental shift within him. The mirror's surface began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its crystalline surface as the false image of himself shattered. When the cracks reached the edges, the mirror exploded in a shower of crystalline fragments that dissolved into pure light before they could hit the ground. Belethria nodded with what might have been approval. "The first trial is complete. You have seen the truth of your weak self and chosen its destruction. Tomorrow brings the trial of strength, where you will discover what remains when all pretense is stripped away." As they walked back through the impossible corridors, Marcus felt fundamentally different. The comfortable lies he had told himself about his motivations and character were gone, leaving behind something raw and uncertain but undeniably real. He no longer felt like he was playing the role of a diplomat, he was simply Marcus Chen, flawed and uncertain, but, finally, honest about both his limitations and his potential. That night, as he lay in his crystal bed staring out at the harmonious lights of Kelthera, Marcus understood that the first trial had accomplished something he had never thought possible. It had shown him who he really was beneath all his careful constructions. Tomorrow would test whether the real Marcus Chen, stripped of pretense and illusion, could find the strength to become someone worthy of the oath he had sworn. The second trial came not with dawn, but in the deep of Kelthera's crystalline night, when the planet's multiple moons created a symphony of reflected light that made the entire landscape glow with otherworldly radiance. Marcus was awakened not by sound, but by a vibration that seemed to emanate from the crystal structure of the spire itself, a thrumming that called to something deep in his bones. Valeria waited for him in the chamber's center, but she was not alone. Beside her stood a figure Marcus had not seen before, another Kelthoran, but one whose presence felt different, more primal. Where Valethria's robe seemed crafted from light and void, this being wore what appeared to be crystallized storm clouds, their surface crackling with contained energy. Their eyes held depths that suggested vast experience with conflict and struggle. "This is Threnodus," Valethria explained as Marcus approached. "Battle sage of the storm peaks, master of the trial of strength. They will guide you through the crucible that separates the merely honest from the truly capable." Threnodus studied Marcus with an intensity that made Valethria's scrutiny seem gentle by comparison. When they spoke, their voice carried the rumble of distant thunder and the whisper of wind through mountain passes. "The human has seen truth," Threnodus said, their words seeming to bypass Marcus's translation device and speak directly to his understanding. "But truth without strength is merely interesting pain. The trial of strength will reveal whether you possess the will to become what your oath demands." Marcus felt a chill of anticipation mixed with fear. The trial of truth had been psychologically demanding, forcing him to confront uncomfortable realities about himself. But something about Threnodus suggested that the trial of strength would be more tangible, more immediately dangerous. "What does the trial involve?" he asked. Threnodus smiled, an expression that seemed to contain both encouragement and warning. "You must climb the Resonance Peak, the highest crystal formation on Kelthora. But this is no simple physical challenge. The peak exists partially outside normal spacetime, and reaching its summit requires not just physical endurance, but the strength to overcome the fundamental limitations of your being." Valethria stepped forward, her expression showing what Marcus had come to recognize as concern mixed with hope. "The climb will test everything about you, your physical capabilities, your mental resilience, your spiritual fortitude. Most who attempt it turn back before reaching the summit. Some are changed by the effort. A few are destroyed by it. And, if I succeed? Then, you will have proven that the honest self revealed by the trial of truth contains the strength necessary to honor your oath," Threnodus replied. "You will have forged yourself into someone who cannot be broken by external forces because you have already broken yourself against your own limitations and emerged intact." Marcus looked out through the crystal walls toward the distant mountain ranges that dominated Kelthora's horizon. Even in the alien moonlight, he could see the towering spire of what must be Resonance Peak, a crystalline needle that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality itself. "When do we begin?" "Now," Threnodus said simply. The journey to the base of Resonance Peak took them through landscapes that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Marcus rode in what Valethria called a harmony craft, a vehicle that moved not by conventional propulsion but by achieving resonance with the crystal formations they passed. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced, not movement through space, but a flowing harmony that carried them across impossible distances in moments. As they traveled, Threnodus shared what Marcus would need to know about the climb ahead. Resonance Peak existed in a state of quantum flux, its structure constantly shifting between possible configurations. The climb would require not just physical strength and endurance, but the ability to adapt to constantly changing reality. "The peak responds to the climber's inner state," Threnodus explained. "Your fears will manifest as obstacles, your doubts as dead ends, your weaknesses as traps that could prove fatal. But your strengths, once fully realized, will create paths where none existed before." Marcus felt his stomach tighten as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a test that would force him to confront every limitation he had ever accepted about himself, every way he had chosen the comfort of weakness over the difficulty of growth. They reached the base of Resonance Peak as Kelthora's primary star began to rise, casting the crystalline spire in brilliant light that seemed to sing with harmonic frequencies. Up close, the peak was even more impossible than it had appeared from a distance. Its surface seemed to shift and flow like liquid crystal, and Marcus could swear he saw glimpses of other realities reflected in its faceted sides. Threnodus handed him equipment unlike anything in his diplomatic kit, climbing gear that seemed to be grown rather than manufactured, its crystalline surfaces warm to the touch and somehow responsive to his thoughts. "Remember," Valethria said as he prepared to begin the climb, this is not about reaching the summit quickly or efficiently. This is about becoming someone strong enough to reach it at all. Let the peak teach you what you need to learn. Marcus placed his first handhold on the crystal surface and immediately understood that this would be unlike any physical challenge he had ever faced. The crystal responded to his touch, shifting and changing to test his grip, his balance, his determination. Within the first few minutes of climbing, he was forced to abandon conventional techniques and learn to move in harmony with the peak itself. As he climbed higher, the first of his internal obstacles began to manifest. His lifelong tendency to take the safe, easy path appeared as smooth, tempting ledges that led nowhere. His habit of giving up when things became difficult materialized as sections where the crystal became impossibly slick, requiring him to develop entirely new reserves of persistence. Hours passed, though time seemed to flow differently on the peak's shifting surface. Marcus found himself climbing not just upward, but through different versions of himself, past selves that whispered about his inadequacies, potential futures that showed him the consequences of continued weakness, present moments that demanded he choose between comfort and growth. Halfway up the peak, exhausted and pushed beyond anything he had thought possible, Marcus encountered his greatest obstacle yet. The crystal surface before him showed not a path upward, but a mirror image of his diplomatic quarters back on the transport ship. All he had to do was step forward, and he could return to his old life, his old limitations, his old comfortable illusions about himself. The temptation was overwhelming. He could claim that the trials had been impossible, that no human could be expected to meet such demands. He could return to Earth with a story of alien irrationality and unreasonable expectations. He could go back to being the person he had always been, is safe, limited, but comfortable in his mediocrity. But, as he stared at this crystalline doorway to his old life, Marcus remembered the weight of his oath and the consequences of breaking it. More than that, he remembered the truth he had seen in the first trial's mirror, the truth about who he had been and who he might become. He turned away from the tempting doorway and continued climbing, even though the crystal surface above seemed to offer no handholds at all. As he reached upward with desperate determination, the crystal responded to his commitment, creating grips and paths that had not existed moments before. The final approach to the summit tested everything he had learned about himself during the climb. The crystal became a maze of possibilities, each path requiring him to overcome a different aspect of his former weakness. He faced his fear of failure, his need for approval, his tendency to avoid responsibility, his habit of speaking without thinking. Each obstacle demanded not just acknowledgement, but active transformation. It wasn't enough to recognize his weaknesses, he had to actively choose strength instead, forging new neural pathways of thought and behavior with each handhold, each step forward. When Marcus finally pulled himself onto the peak's summit, he collapsed onto the crystalline platform, exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced. But, as he lay there, breathing the thin air at the top of Kelthera's highest point, he realized that something fundamental had changed within him. The person who had begun the climb was not the same person who had reached the summit. The weak, uncertain, people-pleasing diplomat was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered reserves of strength he never knew existed. He had literally climbed through his limitations and emerged as a person capable of honoring the weight of his oath. Belethria and Threnodus appeared on the summit platform, arriving through what Marcus now recognized as quantum teleportation, a technology that required the kind of strength and unity he was only beginning to understand. "The second trial is complete," Threnodus announced, their voice carrying new notes of respect. "You have discovered the strength that was always within you, buried beneath layers of accepted limitation. Tomorrow brings the final trial, the trial of unity, where you will learn to harmonize not just with yourself, but with the fundamental forces of existence." As they prepared to descend from Resonance Peak, Marcus looked out over the crystalline landscape of Kelthera with eyes that saw differently than they had before. He was no longer the same person who had accidentally sworn a sacred oath, nor was he the same person who had begun these trials. He was becoming someone new, someone strong enough to bear the weight of his words and wise enough to understand their true implications. The final trial would test whether this transformation was complete, whether the strong self he had forged could achieve true unity with forces beyond himself. But, for the first time since arriving on Kelthera, Marcus felt genuinely confident that he was becoming someone capable of honoring his oath, whatever the cost. The third and final trial began not with dawn or nightfall, but in the liminal space between moments when Kelthera's crystal formations achieved perfect harmonic resonance with the planet's electromagnetic field. Marcus had learned to sense these moments of planetary unity. They felt like the universe itself taking a deep, satisfied breath, all dissonance temporarily resolved into perfect harmony. He stood with Valethria and the full circle of negotiators in the heart of the harmonic matrix, the crystalline structure at the center of their civilization's spiritual and technological infrastructure. The structure had grown during the days of his trials, its faceted surfaces now incorporating patterns that seemed to reflect his own transformation. Marcus realized with a start that the matrix had been learning from him just as he had been learning from it. The trial of unity, Elder Crystallis announced, his ancient voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through multiple dimensions simultaneously, is not a test of your individual capabilities, but of your ability to become part of something greater than yourself while maintaining the integrity of what you have become. Valethria stepped forward, and Marcus was struck by how different she appeared to him now. Where once he had seen an intimidating alien authority figure whose approval he desperately craved, he now saw a being of profound wisdom and strength who had guided him toward discovering his own authenticity. The change in perception, he realized, reflected the change in himself. In your human culture, Valethria said, success is often viewed as individual achievement, the triumph of one person or group over opposition. Our concept of unity success requires the dissolution of such limited thinking. True success creates harmony that strengthens all participants, resonance that builds rather than depletes. Another circle member, whose robe seemed to contain flowing rivers of liquid starlight, continued the explanation. The trial of unity will require you to merge your consciousness temporarily with the harmonic matrix itself, becoming part of our civilization's guiding intelligence while retaining your individual identity and perspective. Only through such unity can you understand what true success in our negotiations requires. Marcus felt a flutter of his old anxiety, but it was different now, not the paralyzing fear of inadequacy he had once known, but the healthy apprehension of someone about to attempt something genuinely challenging. The trials had taught him the difference between fear that weakened and fear that focused. What are the risks? He asked, his question coming from genuine desire to understand rather than desperate need for reassurance. The primary risk is dissolution, Elder Crystallis replied matter-of-factly. Consciousness that lacks sufficient integration may lose coherence when exposed to the matrix's unified field. However, your previous trials have forged the necessary internal unity to maintain identity even within cosmic harmony. Threnodus, who had remained silent during the explanations, now stepped forward with something that looked like a crystalline crown, its surfaces alive with patterns that hurt to look at directly. This is the Unity Crown, they explained. It will facilitate the consciousness merger while providing safeguards against complete dissolution. But, understand, wearing it will change you permanently. You will retain human individual consciousness, but you will also carry within yourself a fragment of Keltheran unity awareness. You will become, in a very real sense, a bridge between our civilizations. Marcus studied the crown, understanding instinctively that accepting it meant accepting a fundamental alteration of his basic nature. He would no longer be purely human, but something new, a hybrid consciousness capable of understanding both individual and unity perspectives. If I do this, he said slowly, and if I succeed in understanding what true negotiation success requires, will I be able to communicate that understanding to my people? That, Valethria replied, is precisely what the trial is designed to determine. Unity without the ability to translate that unity into individual action is merely interesting experience. True unity success requires the ability to build bridges between different forms of consciousness. Marcus looked around the circle of alien faces, each one watching him with expressions that he now understood reflected not judgment, but genuine interest in his choice. They were not demanding that he undergo the trial, they were offering him the opportunity to become something unprecedented, something that could serve both civilizations in ways that no purely human or purely Keltheran consciousness could achieve. I accept the trial of unity, he said, his voice carrying the strength he had discovered on Resonance Peak and the honesty he had found in the mirror of truth. Threnodus placed the unity crown on his head, and Marcus immediately felt reality reorganize itself around him. His individual consciousness suddenly expanded beyond the boundaries of his personal identity, flowing outward to merge with the vast, harmonious intelligence that guided Kelthoran civilization. At first, the experience was overwhelming. Marcus felt himself simultaneously existing as individual Marcus Chen and, as part of something incomprehensibly vast, a collective consciousness that spanned not just the Kelthorans present in the chamber, but every member of their species across multiple star systems, and, beyond that, the resonant intelligence of the crystal formations themselves, and, beyond even that, the harmonic patterns that connected all conscious beings throughout the galaxy. But, instead of losing himself in this vastness, Marcus found that the strength and integration he had developed through the previous trials allowed him to maintain his individual perspective while participating in the unity. He was like a single instrument in a cosmic orchestra, distinct and valuable in his uniqueness, but also part of a harmony far greater than any individual contribution. Through the unity consciousness, Marcus began to understand what true success in the negotiations would require. It wasn't about trade agreements or resource exchanges, those were merely surface manifestations of a deeper possibility. The real opportunity was to create a new form of consciousness that could bridge the gap between individual-focused and unity-focused civilizations. He saw how human individualism, properly integrated, could add new harmonics to Kelthoran unity, creating richer and more complex patterns of consciousness. He saw how Kelthoran unity awareness could help human civilization overcome the destructive conflicts that arose from excessive individualism. Most importantly, he saw how the combination could create something entirely new, a hybrid consciousness that enhanced both perspectives rather than diminishing either. But, achieving this unity success would require more than diplomatic agreements. It would require the creation of bridge beings like himself, individuals who carried both forms of consciousness and could facilitate understanding between the civilizations. It would require humans willing to undergo transformation similar to his own trials, and Kelthorans willing to experience individual consciousness without losing their connection to unity. The vision that emerged from the unity consciousness was breathtaking in its scope and implications. Marcus saw human colonies where individual creativity and innovation were harmonized with Kelthoran unity wisdom, creating civilizations more advanced and fulfilled than either species could achieve alone. He saw exploration vessels crewed by bridge consciousness beings capable of understanding and communicating with forms of life that neither pure human nor pure Kelthoran consciousness could comprehend. He saw the gradual emergence of a galactic civilization based on harmony rather than conflict, unity rather than division. But he also saw the challenges. Creating such unity would require individuals from both species to undergo profound transformation, abandoning comfortable limitations and embracing the difficult growth that true integration demanded. It would require political and social structures capable of supporting hybrid consciousness without losing the valuable aspects of either parent civilization. Most importantly, it would require the kind of absolute commitment that Marcus had accidentally sworn in his oath, the willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve true success, even if it meant becoming something entirely new in the process. As the unity vision reached its culmination, Marcus understood that his oath had never been about ensuring the success of simple trade negotiations. It had been about ensuring the success of a civilizational transformation that would benefit not just humans and Kelthorans, but the entire galaxy. The casual words he had spoken to impress Valethria had bound him to become a catalyst for cosmic evolution. The realization might have been overwhelming for the weak self he had been when he arrived on Kelthora. But the strong self he had become through the trials embraced the magnitude of the task with calm determination. He had been forged in the crucible of truth, strength, and unity specifically to bear this weight. As the unity crown's effects gradually diminished, returning him to primarily individual consciousness while leaving him with permanent access to unity awareness, Marcus found himself back in the harmonic matrix chamber facing the circle of Kelthoran negotiators. But everything had changed. He could see the harmony patterns that connected each of them to the whole, feel the resonant frequencies that linked their thoughts and intentions, understand the deeper currents of meaning that flowed beneath their words. What do you now understand about the success our negotiations must achieve? Valethria asked, though her question carried harmonics that revealed she already knew his answer. Marcus rose from the crystalline platform where he had been kneeling during the consciousness merger, feeling the integration of his human individuality with his new unity awareness settling into permanent patterns within his mind. Success requires the creation of a new form of consciousness, he replied, his words carrying new harmonics that his translation device didn't even attempt to render. Not human or Caltharan, but a bridge consciousness capable of harmonizing individual and unity perspectives. The negotiations aren't about trade agreements, they're about species evolution toward galactic unity. Elder Crystal Lys nodded slowly, his ancient features showing satisfaction. And how will you honor your oath to ensure this success, whatever the cost? Marcus looked around the circle, seeing not just the individuals present but the vast network of consciousness they represented, stretching across star systems and touching forms of awareness he was only beginning to comprehend. I will return to human space and begin the transformation process, he said, understanding the full weight of what he was committing to. I will help identify humans capable of undergoing the trials of truth, strength, and unity. I will work to create the political and social structures necessary to support bridge consciousness beings. And I will do whatever else is required to build the foundation for a truly unified galactic civilization. Valeria stepped forward, and, for the first time since he had met her, Marcus felt that they were meeting as equals, different forms of consciousness, but united in purpose and understanding. Your trials are complete, Marcus Chen of Terra, Bridgewalker between worlds. You have destroyed your weak self and forged yourself into someone capable of honoring the most demanding oaths. You have become someone who cannot be destroyed by others because you have already been destroyed and rebuilt by your own choice. The harmonic matrix pulsed with brilliant light, recording the completion of his transformation and the successful conclusion of his trials. Marcus felt the weight of his original oath lifting, not because it was fulfilled, but because he had become someone for whom honoring such commitments was no longer a burden but simply the natural expression of his transformed nature. As he prepared to return to human space to begin the monumental task of preparing his people for the unity transformation, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had arrived on Calthara as a weak, uncertain diplomat seeking to advance his career through a routine trade mission. He was leaving as something entirely new, a bridge between civilizations, a catalyst for galactic evolution, a being forged in the crucible of truth, strength, and unity. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Marcus now understood this principle not as philosophy, but as lived truth. By choosing to let his limited, fearful, people-pleasing self die in the trials, he had become someone whose strength came not from avoiding challenges but from embracing transformation. He had learned that true invulnerability came not from building walls around weakness, but from developing such integration and authentic strength that external forces could not shake his fundamental identity. His oath to Valeria had seemed like a catastrophic mistake when he first understood its implications. Now he recognized it as the most important moment of his life, the catalyst that had forced him to become who he was truly meant to be. Sometimes, he realized, the universe conspires to save us from the limitations we place on ourselves, even when that salvation comes disguised as binding commitment to impossible standards. As the transport ship Meridian's Edge prepared for departure from Calthara, Marcus stood once more at the viewport, watching the crystal formations fade into the distance. But, this time, he could feel their harmonic resonance even across the growing space, sense the unity consciousness that connected all Caltharan civilization, and know with absolute certainty that he carried within himself the seeds of transformation that would one day unite the galaxy in unprecedented harmony. The weak Marcus Chen who had spoken careless words to impress an alien dignitary was gone forever. In his place stood someone strong enough to honor any oath, wise enough to speak only truth, and united enough to bridge any gap between consciousness and consciousness. The real negotiations, the transformation of galactic civilization itself, were just beginning. And, for the first time in his life, Marcus Chen felt truly ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.